All right, so utility blade, I feel works best. Yeah, so this should be 9 by 12. So let's say you just want to cut it in half. Just mark it in 2 places. And then, personally, I think it's really great to have a ruler that has some sort of like foam or cork backing because it doesn't move around. Because that can be incredibly frustrating. And then you just want to score this once. And then that'll just fold in half. And then you can go over on the other side and just kind of lightly cut these fibers. And then you cut your plate in half. So it's pretty easy. It doesn't really take a whole lot of effort. So you can cut this down into whatever size you want. All right, set those aside. So if you aren't going to freehand your image, which I feel most people do not want to do, you can do an image transfer. So I would suggest investing in like a small pad of tracing paper, because then you can flip it over and see through it. So basically, when you're working with most printmaking processes, the image that you're going to be working with is going to be backwards. Because when you end up printing it, it ends up being a mirror image of the image that you carved. So the tracing paper helps with that, because then you can sit there and draw the image that you want to, you know, on the paper. Like you want things in specific areas. Like when it's printed, say you want to do an image of a tree and you want to have a flower in the lower right-hand corner. When you end up transferring this, you're going to be flipping this over and laying it down so that it looks as though the flower is in the lower left-hand corner. But when it ends up getting printed, it'll be in the right corner. So you have your image. And I'm just going to hypothetically piece this back together. So there is actually this really fantastic transfer paper. You can get it at Blick. You can get it, I think you can get it at like Michael's, maybe Joann's. You can also make it. So if you just take like basically a pencil, or like if you have chunks of graphite, just cover a piece of tracing paper with graphite, and then you have a piece of transfer paper. So this is, because this is pigment that's on here. There's a little bit of yellow on my thumb. So this ends up rubbing off when you draw on the backside. So what you're going to do is you're going to take your plate and you're going to set this down. If you need to just kind of stabilize it and keep it in place, you can tape it down with like a piece of painter's tape. right, so then you're going to take your drawing and you're going to put it face down onto the transfer paper. And then taking, I mean, you can, if you want, you can do a marker again. And you're going to trace that image. And I mean, you do want to put a little bit of pressure down just in case. All right, and here's this goofy little flower. All right, so then you remove that. And then when you remove the transfer paper, so you can see how, you can lightly see where the image was drawn. And so that pigment was then transferred onto the plate. And then you can see it transferred onto the plate. And I mean, it doesn't wipe off super easily, which is kind of nice. So if you're like a pretty heavy-handed person and you sit there and, you know, work with your hand on the surface you're working with, it shouldn't come off, or at least it won't come off very easily. So then you have your image, and now you have an image that you can work with. You also want to keep in mind that the areas you carve away will not print. So if you end up doing a line drawing, like hypothetically you got this tree, but you want that tree to print black, you will not carve away those lines. You'll carve around those lines. And then vice versa. If you want it to be a negative, you're going to be carving away those lines. So then when you carve those lines away, those will print white. Or technically they won't print at all. The background will print black, and then the tree will be white. So I'm going to show how to carve into this. All right, so everyone has their tool, their speedball tool. So everyone has like a more modern version. I have an old school one that doesn't twist on, it just plops on, so it's a little bit difficult to take apart. But your tool has blades in the butt of the handle. So everyone should have 4 blades. You should have a 1, a 2, a 3, and a 5. You don't have a 4 because it's kind of a weird shape. It's more box shaped. It's actually, in my opinion, pretty cumbersome to carve with. The 5 is a wide U. That's used for taking out larger areas. So you can see how wide that is. So that's a 5. And then the 3 is a deep V. So it's still pretty good for clearing out slightly larger areas. But it's for like basically the medium-sized areas that need to be cleared out. And then the 2 is just a slightly narrower V. And then the 1 is like a super fine point, like tiny fine point. This is basically, so if you wanted to hypothetically leave the tree image, you would go around the line with the 1 first to basically get that line started. So to put the blade in the tool, so this top part unscrews. Don't unscrew it all the way. You just need to unscrew it so that you can hear those parts moving. So within this, within the head, there are 2 little bits. And these 2 little bits are where the blade is going to sit. So you have these 2 little bits, and the blade is going to eventually sit in between the two of them. And then when you tighten this up, it ends up securing the blade into your carving tool. So I'll just piece that back together. Ooh, that needs some WD-40. All right, so you're going to slide that in so that the small U is on top of the blade, and then the larger piece is on the bottom, and then you're just going to tighten that up. And then the blade won't come out. And also, obviously, like, please be careful when you're using these blades. They are really sharp. Even though right now, if you have new blades, they do need to be used a few times before they start working properly. That's why that extra piece of linoleum is in your kit. But they are sharp. I mean, we're using it to cut linoleum, so it will very much cut you if you're not careful. Also, always carve away from yourself. Don't carve this way. I don't know why a lot of people feel they need to carve that way, because they think that they're getting maybe a more secure handle on the tool. You're literally carving like right to your chest. So don't do that. I mean, practice a little bit. I feel like everyone holds these things differently. I usually end up holding mine like this. I mean, that way you're holding it with two hands. You have pretty good control over it. Don't gouge the plate. If you cut too deeply, here, you know what? I'll show you with, let's see if I can get this just to like, yeah, so if you cut too deeply, you're not going to have very much control. And so the whole reason, like for instance, the whole reason you use the one blade is to get a really fine line. So if you're carving too deeply, you end up having this happen. Do you see where it ends up getting wider at the end? Like, you don't want that to happen. If you want to take out more material, you use a wider blade. You want kind of a nice, even line like this. All right, so here's the line of the tree. So on part of it, I'm gonna sit there and carve around. And when you get to the end, of where you're carving, just basically lift the blade up a little bit. Because you also don't want to do, this. So you can't see it very well, but there's like this super fine line at the end, like there's like a little tail. So you don't want that to happen because that would probably end up printing. Yeah, so like I said, if you wanted the line of the tree to actually be printed, I would suggest first carving around that line with the one blade and then switching to, now let's just go to the 5 blade. So the 5 blade is that really wide, that wide U. So that's going to clear out like probably 3 or 4 times as much material as the one blade. And then you're just going to go up to the line that you had already carved. Yeah, see, so that takes out way more than the one blade. So then you're going to be using that to like what's called clearing out an area. Yeah, the 5 works really well for that. Oh. And this is where this comes in. So you have that underneath it, it's not going to move around. Well, now it's moving because it's on this mat, but like it's not going to move around on you, which is good because then it's secure. Like you're not going to possibly skip or like accidentally cut yourself. This keeps your plate from moving around. So in terms of design, I would suggest putting some sort of border on your image, only because, and I'll show you this when I ink up the plate, when you have a border, it basically keeps the brayer level and you won't end up getting ink in little nooks and crannies that you don't want printed. So I would suggest incorporating some sort of border. Honestly, even if you don't want a border printed, you can tape that off while you're inking, and I'll show you how to do that. But just having a border there is a good idea to just basically keep the brayer even while you're inking. It's not going to sit there and tip like this. It'll just stay even keel. All right, another thing, just from like personal experience, so this can also be kind of strenuous on your hands. So don't forget to take breaks every now and then and move your fingers around, just so you don't get cramps or anything like that. I know that might sound kind of silly, but I don't know, as someone who's worked with their hands for like 20 years, it definitely takes a toll on your hands. So like take breaks and like do exercises to just move your fingers around a little bit. All right, so that's carving. Does anyone have any questions so far?
I have a question. I was doing this at a friend's house recently for the first time.
Sure.
So I obviously didn't know as much as what I was doing. But I noticed like it hurt my hands, and I guess I was wondering like, is it supposed to hurt your hands? Maybe I was applying like too much pressure. I guess I don't know. I gotta work on like how I handle it.
You may have been using too much pressure, because it's the type of thing where if you're like basically if you're digging too deep, it takes a lot more effort to move to like carve into that much material.
Yeah.
Because I mean, this really isn't that deep of a cut, and even looking at it in the plate, like you shouldn't. Here, how can I? All right, so hypothetically, here's the shape of your blade. When you're scooping into the material, it shouldn't go deeper than that. Like if your corners end up going into the material, into the linoleum, that's way too deep.
Okay, that's good to know.
Yeah. So does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, because I have to admit, the first time I did a linoleum cut, oh my gosh, I I basically tried, when I was carving, I basically tried to cut deep enough to where this, like the basically the lip of the blade, the lips, was like flush with the material, and it was so difficult. And it also ends up taking out chunks versus taking out like a smooth, consistent line. It'll take massive chunks out of it, and that can end up causing you to like cut into the line you're trying to keep. So yeah, that's why I ended up giving everyone an extra piece of linoleum so you can kind of practice.
Is it the smaller one?
Yes. Yeah, it should be the smallest of those, but quite honestly, you can kind of use whichever one you want. But yeah, I would practice. Also, just because like I said, I think everyone has at least like 2 or 3 brand new blades, so they've never been used before. So they basically need to get honed on the linoleum to kind of sharpen them up a little bit. All right, so it's carving, image transfer.
What would you do if one of your blades has a chip in it?
Has a chip in it.
Mm-hmm.
Angel, are you the one that has 2 of them?
Yeah.
Whatever number that is, just take that number out of the other tool.
Okay.
Yeah, and then you can just put those back into the butt of the tool and close that. All right, so for printing, you're going to use that piece of plexiglass that you have in your kit. Here are my cleaning supplies. Got a couple rags. So I started using latex gloves while I was printing, just because, especially since it's winter, I don't know, my skin is super sensitive and has become more so over the last few years. It's also just way easier to clean up. All right, so we have the plate. I'm gonna use a tiny piece of anti-skid underneath that to keep it from moving. We have our brayer. We have a palette knife. We have ink. And this ink I'm using is a little bit different from what you all have in your kits, so I'm going to be mixing what's called set swell in it. It just kind of makes it a little bit more malleable and easy to work with. All right, so I'll scoop out a little bit of set swell. Other side. All right, so you all have tubes of ink, so you're just gonna squeeze a little bit of ink out of the tube. And for the most part, the ink you have should be fine, but it does kind of need to be warmed up a little bit. So you're gonna do what's called working the ink. And this ink I'm using has a few little globs in it. You can just pick those out. But yeah, kind of a really good way to work and warm up the ink is basically just scooping it and spreading it over and over. Actually, this looks really good. Yeah, you kind of want it to have a consistency close, like, you know, when like a stick of butter is at the consistency where you can take a butter knife and like scoop some off of it and spread it onto toast without it being liquid yet. That's the kind of consistency you want. Like, you want it kind of gelatinous, but you don't want it closer to liquid. You want like a really nice in between of liquid and solid. I know that kind of sounds stupid, but spreadable butter. That's the kind of consistency you want. Spreadable butter. Okay, so that actually looks really good. So because this space is so tiny, we're just gonna scoop that up and put that in the corner. And then what you're gonna do is you're gonna scoop a little of it up. You don't need much. And you're gonna spread it across your plate, your palette. So obviously, so this is a half plate. So this is 9 by 6. So this should be plenty of ink to ink this up once. Just kind of pay attention to how much ink you're using. Obviously, if you end up doing, that's a little bit better. If you were to use the entire large plate, the 12 by 9, you'll need like twice as much ink as this. So just kind of keep that in mind. So now you're gonna ink up your plate. So you're gonna take your brayer, and you can
I have
hear.
a quick question.
Yeah.
Did we get like a little inking knife, or should we use something else?
You did not get inking knives in your kits. I mean, you can get those. I know Blick has them. They're like $2. You can get them at a hardware store too. If you have plastic palette knives, like if you've taken painting and you have plastic palette knives, you can totally use that. It's just they're basically just used to work the ink and warm it up. But you can kind of hear that sticky tacky noise. That's a good noise. You want to hear that noise. You don't want to hear necessarily more than that. Like, you don't want to hear it going. That's way too much. All right, so this isn't moving. Yeah, you want to ink it up kind of from every direction. right, so you can see, and granted this is stained from a previous printing, but you can see that it has like a nice even cover. All right, so now the experimenting is going to happen in terms of printing this by hand. All right, so the paper that you all got in your kits is a kozo paper, so it's a Japanese paper. It's pretty lightweight. It does have two textures to it. One side feels a little bit more fuzzy than the other. You want to print on the smoother of the two sides. So we're just gonna lay this down. Then I'm just going to take a piece of newsprint. And then you can either use a wooden spoon, metal spoon, the eyeglass, and the rolling pin. So those are the four things that I'm going to kind of experiment with first. So I think the metal spoon will probably be the best. Yeah, like it doesn't take a whole lot of pressure. I mean, yeah, you don't need to put a whole lot of pressure down because if you do, you're going to end up causing damage to the paper. So for the most part, I feel like you don't necessarily need to have anything on top of this while you're printing because you can also see, or maybe you can't see. So as you're printing, you're going to start seeing where there's enough pressure being put down. So if you want to, you can just keep printing on top of the paper itself. Again, obviously you want to be careful. If you end up putting way too much pressure down, you're going to end up damaging the paper. I do have to admit, this stuff is pretty resilient. And you also want to work, usually you want to work from the inside out, because when you end up putting pressure on the inside of the print, so the paper is sticking to the plate. And then it just basically gives you a little bit more control. Let me see if this is. Oh, actually. You take a piece of your tracing paper. Yeah, take a piece of your tracing paper, because then you can see through the tracing paper to see how your inking is coming along. All right, so that's metal spoon. You can also use a wooden spoon. Yeah, and the wooden spoon is actually printing just as well. And to admit, it kind of glides a little bit better while you're printing. All right, and then try the eyeglass. This is just going to be like trial and error, depending on how you hold it. Yeah, actually that prints pretty great. So I would suggest, like if you're using the eyeglass, holding it like this, where you basically have like your index and middle finger putting pressure down, and then your thumb and ring finger are holding onto it, and basically just like, you know, whatever, like using your pinky as like stability or leverage, you know. But yeah, that prints nice. That actually prints really nice. And you should have two of them. I think one of the glasses is a little bit thinner than the other. Just obviously like use with caution, so you don't break it or hurt yourself with it. Like when you're holding it, put more pressure on the inside than on the outside. But yeah, that prints really well. Okay, and then, yeah, I don't know how well this is gonna work. I was gonna try to experiment with this and maybe like cut up a yoga mat and cut it so it's the same, like the size will fit on here perfectly, and then just glue it on there. Because I'm not exactly sure how well this will work. Oh, it's not too bad. It's not super dark. Yeah, so I don't know if that necessarily added to it. It definitely did move the paper a little bit, so it's a little bit blurry, but yeah. Yeah, so if you wanted to put a little bit more ink down, and actually, I'll show you really quick. I'll just show you really quick essentially how to make a map. When you have a specific size piece of paper that you're printing onto, and then a specific size plate. So what you're going to do first, and this is the type of thing where if you're like when you're printing an edition by hand, this will help. So you have a piece of newsprint, and then you take the piece of paper that you're going to be printing onto, and you simply mark the corners. And then you take your plate, you figure out exactly where you want it placed. So like, say you want to print the linoleum so that when printed, it's in the upper left corner. So then you put the plate in the upper right corner, get it exactly where you want it, and then you trace that. So then you have You have where the plate's going to be. You have where the paper's going to be. And then if you were to decide you wanted to do an addition with that, all right, let's ink up the plate again. And then you would bring in your map, set that down. Set your plate down. Find the smooth side of the printing paper. You basically line up the two corners and then let it fall. Okay, let's... Yeah, and start in the middle, work your way out. And then you can just lift a corner to see how the printing is going. Just kind of check. Make sure you're putting enough pressure on. Make sure you don't miss an area. And honestly, same with this. Take breaks in between printing. It's a little bit more physically demanding than obviously like running it through a press. Yeah, that's looking really good. So a good person to look up, like if any of you are on Instagram, a good person to look up is Mike Pennekamp. He works a lot with linoleum and does a lot of hand printing. His handle is Mike Face Killa, Killah. And his videos are actually pretty informative in watching him print by hand. So if you have a moment, I would highly recommend checking his stuff out and just kind of watch to see how he does it. He's been printing by hand for years. He's actually the reason that you all are using the ink you're using, even though it is mixed with another ink, because he said he had really good luck with it. So. Yeah, so to check To check to see if you have to continue printing, basically put a little bit of pressure down in the middle and then just lift up each corner to kind of see how everything is going. Like this side needs a little bit more pressure. It's actually printing pretty well. All right. So then to take it off, just basically take it from a corner, peel it away. Yeah, so that's actually a lot better. So that's a little bit more ink. So that's the second one. And then that's the first one. So you can see there's a little bit of difference. This one's definitely darker. Yeah, so you're gonna have to, you're gonna have to do a little bit of experimenting just to kind of see how much ink you need. But yeah, that actually printed really well. Okay, so now I'll show you how to do cleanup. It's pretty easy. It's not too stressful. I'm gonna throw on another pair of gloves because I already got ink on my hands. All right, so first things first, so I have quite a bit of ink left over. You guys can see that. So I do want to save that, mainly because, ink is expensive. If you're able to save it, save it. So you can use, and I haven't had a whole lot of experience using cling wrap, but you can use cling wrap or you can use aluminum foil. I usually end up using aluminum foil just because if you've ever used cling wrap, it's a little stressful. It's kind of a stressful material. But what's nice about cling wrap is that you also can see exactly what is wrapped up. So you'll be able to see what color it is without it getting messy. You also just have to be careful because you're going to be using, you're going to be using a sharp object to put the ink into the cling wrap. So lay the cling wrap down. Just gonna scoop that up. And that wasn't that much. But you can either wrap it up like this. You essentially have this little little blob of ink. And then when you're ready to go, you can basically just pierce that and squeeze it out, which is kind of nice. You don't have to open up a piece of tinfoil or anything like that. Or if you're gonna go with the tinfoil method, just basically lay same thing, have a piece of tinfoil down, like I'll scoop up this set swell. And that will only be used with black ink. Yeah, scoop into that. And then when you're using the tinfoil, so like obviously this is pretty airtight. Like like air's not gonna get into that. With the tinfoil, you wanna make sure you fold it properly. So I usually end up folding it in half. And then just basically fold it into, I don't know, thirds maybe. And then take the ends and fold that down. And if for some reason, like, so there's a little bit of black in here, you can take your finger and just mark what color is in the tin foil. So you can either do saran wrap or the tin foil. Both, you have to be careful because like I said, you are using what could be like a sharp point. So just be careful with that. All right, so try not to get any ink on your map. If you're gonna be using that again, set that aside. And then have a piece of newsprint handy for cleanup. So basically try to scrape off whatever is left over on this. You'll also want to take your brayer Also, if you are going to sit there and wear gloves while you're doing cleanup or anything like that, also just keep in mind that ink is going to get on your hands still. You just won't be able to feel it, but it's there. And just kind of be aware so you don't so you don't accidentally touch your face, or like if you're for some reason wearing an article of clothing that you really enjoy, you don't accidentally touch it, because this will come off onto the clothing. But yeah, try to get whatever excess ink is on the brayer, roll that off, just fold this in half so you have another clean surface. So for cleaning supplies, I usually actually use just vegetable oil. Pam kind of turned me on to using Crisco. It's a little bit easier to work with. It's pretty gelatinous. You just need to scoop a little bit out, put that on your palette, take your palette knife and just spread it around. Basically treat the Crisco like you would the ink. So scoop it up, spread it around, scoop it up, spread it around. And that's cleaning off a lot of the ink. So scoop that and just spread it onto the piece of newsprint. All right, there's Crisco residue on here. Take your brayer and roll it onto that. So use your preliminary rag to basically wipe off the vegetable oil residue. Actually, so it comes off pretty well. Please do not let your brayers sit past the time that you're working with ink on them. It'll totally destroy them. It basically puts like a crusty layer on it. Like if it's stained, whatever, that's totally fine. As of right now, the brayers, the two brayers and the carving tools are going to need to be returned. So just be careful with them. All right, so then that can be set aside. Gonna wipe off the excess ink off of the palette knife. And remember, a palette knife technically has 5 sides. It has both flat sides and then it has 3 edges. And ink will get on the edges. So you want to make sure that you clean that as well. All right, and then still using your preliminary rag, try to wipe off as much of the ink as possible. And then I suggested to everyone to get Simple Green. Personally, I think this is like one of the best cleaners. It's not super toxic, which is nice. But just spray down. Everything, and then with a clean rag, you're going to wipe that off. So wipe off your palette. So that's nice and clean. Wipe off your palette knife. So that's nice and clean. And then wipe off your brayer. And like I said, the brayers are going to stain a little bit. It's totally fine. But you do just want to wipe it off as best as you can. And even wipe off the edges. Yeah. And then take your gloves off. And if you're able to, I realize that like everyone's home studio situation is different than obviously working in the classroom. But if you're able to hang these up, so like basically then this rag will be the preliminary rag for the next cleanup. And like this one's not super filthy, but like you can sit there and cut it and use this as like still a final cleanup rag. So you can do that. Oh, shoot. And then you sometimes forget that you also have your plate that you have to clean off. So what would be nice if we were working in the studio with a press, you'd run this through the press a few times to try to get as much of that ink off as possible. Holy moly. Man, trying to get latex gloves on and off, it's kind of disgusting. All right, we're just gonna freehand this. So same thing on this. So what would have been nice is like being able to use the brayer to like move this around. So basically you're just gonna scoop a little bit of Crisco. Just kind of move it around the plate. So use your preliminary rag. And that takes it off really well. But it's really greasy, so just kind of keep that in mind. If you don't have a work surface that you don't care gets dirty, putting down like a little piece of plastic or tarp, or like I usually always end up putting down like craft paper or newsprint, just to make the cleanup a lot easier. Like if you end up having that plastic tarp, you can clean that afterwards with just like a little spray of Simple Green. Or if you end up using newsprint or like a sheet of butcher paper, you can just fold that up and toss it. Yeah, you want to try to clean out the nooks and crannies as best as you can. All right, so then this is pretty, like this is getting to the brink of being like pretty shot, but if you hang this up and just let it kind of air out, you can still use it to clean, like I said, preliminary cleanup, and spray it with the Simple Green. And like I said, it's gonna stain a little bit, it's totally normal. Yeah, so then that's good. And then so to clean your hands, I mean, like I said, Dawn dish soap works really, really well. I would highly recommend investing in like a nail brush. Those things are great. Lava soap works really well. I know a few hardware stores carry that. It just has like a little bit of pumice in it. So that stuff works really well. But don't clean this stuff off in the sink. Like don't take this over to the sink and wash it like a dish. Like you're gonna cause major problems. Because like oil and water don't mix. It's gonna make a massive mess in your sink. Like it will possibly contaminate your food because it'll contaminate, like it'll eventually contaminate dishes and stuff like that. So don't ever wash this in the sink. You don't need to. And you don't need to wash the brayer in the sink. You don't need to wash the pellet knife. Like none of this ever needs to go near a sink. If for some reason your hands, like to me this isn't that bad, but like if your hands get really, really disgusting, literally just take a scoop of the Crisco and just work it around your hands. And it takes pretty much everything off. And then just use a rag to wipe off as much as you can. And then just wash your hands in the sink with dish soap. Because that'll take pretty much everything off. I mean, yeah, your hands might get a little stained. It's not too bad. But yeah, just keep that in mind not to wash, like don't wash anything in the sink. Nothing ever needs to be washed in the sink.